This is Chapter 5 of Paul Bahn's Archaeology, a very brief introduction. Hard as it is to figure out the nuts and bolts of life, technology, subsistence, etc., it is infinitely harder to get inside people's minds and try to get an inkling of what they believed and how they thought. If you can't even read your spouse's thoughts, or would prefer not to, after umpteen years of marriage, imagine what a challenge it is to reconstruct what have been called, in ghastly jargon, prehistoric mind ways. This is where we turn to those brave souls who aspire to an archaeology of a mind. The cognitive archaeologists, or coggies as they have known, refuse to accept that ancient thoughts, beliefs, and social relations have gone forever, and believe that they can resurrect them through logic applied to the art and material remains that are reckoned to be connected with religion and ritual or such like. Many scholars are currently striving to develop explicit procedures for analyzing the cognitive aspects of early societies, especially of those for which we have no written text to help. There are numerous encouraging approaches to this seemingly impossible task. For example, one can investigate how people described and measured their world, how they planned and laid out their monuments and towns, and which materials they prized highly and presumably considered to be symbols of wealth and power. And in particular, one can tackle the material remains of religion. It has been said with some truth that religion is, basically, humankind's attempt to communicate with the weather, and a great deal of effort in the past was devoted to this endeavor. Despite the well-known archaeological temptation to call anything ritual that looks odd, it remains true, as we know from modern studies of primitive people, that religious activities are often of paramount importance in life. Indeed, since there is usually no clear dividing line between the sacred and the secular, much of life can seem to be ultimately devoted to religion. The dates for some basic evidence of thought have been pushed back in recent years. For example, the deliberate burial of humans was long thought to start with the Neanderthals of Eurasia between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago. Many cases are known, one of them a famous burial cave in Shanidar Cave, Iraq, where the body seems to have been accompanied by flowers, judging by the pollen found with the bones. However, the finds down the pit of bones at Atapuerca, see page 13, are a strong indication that more than 600,000 years ago, some kind of funerary ritual was being carried out, since scores of bodies were being deliberately brought here and deposited in the pit. This is not a living site. There are no tools or other remains of domestic refuse here, nor were the bodies dragged here by carnivorous animals. There are no tooth marks in the bones, all parts of the body are present, and there are no remains from other prey animals. In 1998, a remarkable, pristine red quartzite hand axe, nicknamed Excalibur, was found among the bones, most probably some kind of offering. So in this case, one can be fairly sure, merely from the content and context of the finds, that some rudimentary religious ritual was occurring. The same applies to art. Art is a notoriously difficult concept with which to grapple, and debate still rages over how to define it. Perhaps the simplest course is to adopt its century-old definition as the work of people as opposed to that of nature, thus avoiding any differentiation of the diversity of forms, content, or intention. As with religion, it is very difficult in many primitive societies to separate art from non-art. Such divisions have no meaning to the people, who see all their art as functional, either directly as a usable artifact or indirectly as a way of communicating with the spirits of or gods, or the weather, or whatever. It all has significance, meaning, and function, and many peoples simply could not understand our concept of art as being something separate or special or non-functional. For many years, art was seen as something which began with modern humans in Europe, for example, with the first portable art and cave drawings of the last ice age. None of this has stood up to scrutiny. First, every continent now has art of equal antiquity, with Australia having the world's oldest dated rock engravings, more than 40,000 years if the AMS dates are correct. And even more important, it is now clear that art occurs well before modern humans. This was also known for decades, since a Neanderthal burial from southwest France was found covered by a stone slab with a series of little cup marks, small round hollows, carefully arranged on it. But this was also always dismissed by the archaeological establishment as a freak, a one-off, which could not hold a candle to the wonders of later cave art like Lascaux, and Altamira. Now, however, we not only have growing numbers of examples of simple Neanderthal art of different kinds, but it has also become clear that they use cosmetics, as found on shells from Neanderthal sites in Spain. There are even earlier occurrences of aesthetic activity. For example, the South African cave of Blombos has recently yielded the remains of a 100,000-year-old ochre processing workshop, with toolkits used for the production of an ochre-rich compound and its storage in shell containers. The most striking example of aesthetic practice is a little pebble of volcanic rock found at Barakat Ram, an open-air site on the Golan Heights, Israel, in the 1980s. Its natural shape resembles a woman, but there are grooves around the neck and down the arms, and the problem was whether these lines were also natural or were humanly made. Microscopic analysis by American researcher Alexander Marshak proved them beyond all doubt to be artificial. So this pebble is unquestionably a figurine, an art object, yet it dates to at least 230,000 years ago and possibly much more. So here, once again, we have clear evidence of cognitive activity. The pebble's natural resemblance to a woman was recognized and then deliberately enhanced. Even if one adheres to the traditional dogma that true art began with modern humans the last ice age, it would nevertheless still be true that prehistoric art, and rock art in particular, constitutes 99% of art history. It is ironic that most books on the history of art begin with a token photo of cave art, usually Lascaux or Altamira, neither of which is really representative, or of a female figurine, usually one of the really obese ones, which are equally unrepresentative, before moving on to the more familiar ground of Egypt and Greece. Yet Lascaux, at about 17,000 years ago, lies at the halfway mark in the history of art, and of course, in the light of the Barakat Ram figurine, one could say Lascaux begins the very late phase of art history. Prehistoric art not only has a huge time span, but also comprises a vast array of types and topics, from scratches on bone to wonderful polychrome paintings, from simple finger markings on clay to sophisticated three-dimensional structures. So one can find everything and anything in it that one wishes. Thus, those humbugs and their gullible readers, who in the 1970s proclaimed that there is evidence of extraterrestrials or ancient astronauts in the archaeological record, even found images in rock art that looked, to them at least, like spacemen. It is fairly obvious from what we know of primitive art today that prehistoric art must have been multi-purpose, encompassing games, myths, narratives, graffiti, messages, creation myths, and religion. Not all of it is necessarily serious and earnest, displaying terror of the supernatural. Much may be rather a celebration of life, a reflection of fun and frivolity. Some of it is public, on open view out of doors. Some is intensely private, hidden away in recesses or deep caves. But despite this flagrant diversity, many people who study rock art, or even just Ice Age art, have an inherent tendency to put single, all-encompassing explanations on it. In fact, this happens in every aspect of archaeology, and is perhaps an inbuilt fault in scholarship that as soon as one stumbles upon what seems like a good idea, usually borrowed from someone else, preferably in another discipline, there is an irresistible urge to apply it to everything in sight and subjugate every aspect of a supremely diverse phenomenon to a steamroller interpretation. The chosen interpretations tend to reflect contemporary obsessions and prejudices. At first, prehistoric art was thought to be mindless graffiti or play activity, art for art's sake. Then, at the turn of the century, as accounts began to appear about what modern primitive peoples did, some simplistic ideas were applied quite uncritically to prehistoric art, most notably that had a magical purpose to help with hunting or fertility. In the 1950s, French structuralism led to new ideas about cave art having a definite and recurring structure, while the swinging 60s saw a proposal that the animals in the caves were sexual symbols. The space age led to a focus on possible lunar notations and other astronomical observations being perceptible in some prehistoric art and monuments. The computer age inevitably led to a view of rock art as being like a series of giant floppy disks or CD-ROMs, with information being recorded there for storage and instant recall. The recently fashionable theory That rock art consists largely of trance imagery seems to have been the direct legacy of the drug culture of the late 1960s and 70s, with its attendant interest in mysticism and shamanism, hallucinogens, altered states of consciousness, and so forth, culminating in the massive literature of the New Age. Regardless of these interpretations, all of which probably hold some truth, the fact remains that only the artist can tell you what the art represents and what the purpose was. We cannot be sure of anything. In a famous experiment, an Australian scholar asked some Aborigines to identify some animals in a rock art panel. Their identifications differed markedly from those reached by Western zoological reasoning. Out of 22 images, the Western scholars have been wrong about 15 and only superficially right about the other 7. But since we have no prehistoric informants, and shall therefore never have access to the original meaning of the art, we can only try to assess what it seems to depict and what its significance might have been. Rock art was certainly used at times to record and transmit information. Things become far easier for the cognitive archaeologist when real scripts are concerned. But first they have to be deciphered. This is a highly specialized skill requiring a very particular kind of analytical mind. There have been some notable pioneers, such as Champollion, who first deciphered ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, helped enormously by the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which had identical texts in Egyptian and Greek. In this century, one major figure, venerated all the more because, like some pop stars, he died young at the peak of his fame, was Michael Ventris, an architect who declared in 1952 that he had deciphered Linear B, an early script from the Aegean, as an archaic form of Greek. Although the script was found in Greek, there is no truth to the tale that one tablet read, "It is a small thing, but Minoan." He was met, like most pioneers, not by congratulations, but by the indignant howl of denial from fellow specialists. This is par for the course in all branches of archaeology, as is the fact that when, soon afterwards, a whole library of Linear B tablets were unearthed in Greece, translations of which fully confirmed Ventris's claim, the experts were left with no alternative. They accused the excavator and Ventris of forgery. Don't imagine that decipherment is a dying art. It is still very much alive and kicking. It is only in the last few years that the complex Maya script of Mesoamerica has begun to be properly understood after a century of cumulative research efforts. And the far rarer Rongo script from Easter Island, which only survives on 25 pieces of wood, has been cracked, at least in terms of its structure and general content. But there is still plenty of work to be done, and the still undeciphered Linear A of the Aegean and the Indus script of ancient India and Pakistan are still major challenges for enthusiasts who wish to tease their brains. Once texts can be read, they can obviously provide a great deal of valuable information about cognitive aspects of the past. For example, the inscriptions from classical sites or the first writings by colonizers, etc. However, as with history as a whole, the written word should always be seen as a complement to archaeology, never a substitute for it. This is especially true for ancient societies where writing was used for very restricted purposes, and literacy was the prerogative of an elite minority. In classical Greece, on the other hand, literacy was widespread, and writing touched nearly all aspects of life, both public and private, so texts can provide considerable insight, for example, in identifying deities and myths in art. Without classical literature, most scenes in Greek and Roman art would mean very little to us. But as ever, texts also incorporate biases and lack completeness. An entire area of cognitive archaeology is taken up with archaeoastronomy, the study of ancient knowledge of celestial phenomena. As mentioned above, there may well be lunar notations from the last ice age. The phases of the moon would certainly have been the principal way that ancient peoples could measure the passage of time. But the subject really comes into its own in later prehistory with the phenomenon of monuments aligned on significant astronomical events such as the rising of the midwinter or midsummer sun. From the prehistoric megalithic monuments of Western Europe to major buildings in the Central and South American civilizations, there are definite alignments which demonstrate a profound knowledge of, and importance attached to the movements of the heavens. Megalith, incidentally, is from the Greek for big stone, as opposed to microlith, another important term in archaeology used to describe very small stone tools. The simplest form of megalith is a single standing stone, like those which Obelix carries around in the Asterix comic strip. In France and elsewhere, the correct term for such a stone is menhir. In Europe, such menhirs are sometimes arranged in rows, in groups, or alignments, while in Britain, especially, they form circles or ellipses. Many of these are thought to have astronomical alignments, though it is not always possible to be certain, since there are so many things in the heavens that the chances are high that a circle of regularly or irregularly placed stones will be aligned on something significant quite by chance. Nevertheless, a number of professional astronomers in the 1960s and 1970s dazzled the largely innumerate archaeological world with the complex calculations and jargon designed to prove that prehistoric people had capabilities so profound that they could construct megalithic computers. For example, Stonehenge was a massive, accurate eclipse predictor. Once these excesses had been debunked, the field was left open to more rational minds who have devoted a great deal of time and effort, in the face of enormous initial skepticism, which was gradually transformed into a somewhat grudging acceptance, to prove that many of the European circles are indeed roughly but purposely aligned on astronomical phenomena, presumably for calendrical purposes, so farmers would know when to plant crops and when to harvest. Or should one assume they could manage this without giant stone calendars? One of the main proponents of this view, a Scottish engineer, Alexander Thom, also made accurate plans of the British circles and believed that a standard unit of measurement had been used in their layout, what he called the megalithic yard, or 2.72 feet. Although it is difficult to make accurate measurements in such monuments, the stones were often crude and irregularly shaped, so how do you know where to place the end of the tape measure? It is now generally accepted that a standard measurement was probably used. However, the most likely explanation is that, rather than resorting to sophisticated mathematics, the monument builders simply used the human pace to put their stones in place. People, too, were put firmly in their place in early societies, as in today's, and this can be seen through the existence of symbols of power, ranging from giant statues of rulers, Mount Rushmore, down to rich clothing or body decoration, designer labels, diamond earrings, all of them essentially useless but considered valuable by the elite. Rare or precious materials are usually a giveaway, as are fine objects that are beautifully made but could never have been used for their apparent purposes. Friable axes, sheet bronze shields, wafer-thin stone spear points. Burials containing such prestige goods can plausibly be interpreted as those of rich and or powerful people, and serve to underline the hierarchy in society. The ultimate examples, of course, are the incredible lavish tombs of rulers known in all the major civilizations, from Ur and King Tut to China's terracotta army and Peru's lords of Sipan, and the imposing art and architecture associated with the elite in these and other cultures. One can never be 100% certain of anything in the past, such as the simple equation of wealth with status. After all, today's incredibly wealthy rulers of Saudi Arabia are buried with nothing. But by and large, it seems sensible to assume that those with rich graves were comfortably off in life too. It is important to note that the deposition of objects with the dead does not necessarily indicate any belief in an afterlife. In some cultures, it brings bad luck for someone to use a dead person's possessions, so these are buried with the deceased. The presence of food in a tomb, however, is a pretty clear indication that its occupant is expected to have a chance to take a snack after death, in the next world, and thus points to some kind of religious belief. The same is true if one finds the deceased is accompanied by servants who have been purposely slaughtered to continue their jobs forever in the afterlife. A pretty rotten deal all around for the workforce. Religion was often used in these societies as another means of maintaining the status quo, but its recognition in archaeological material is not always an easy task, especially where it is embedded in everyday activities. There are, however, a number of obvious clues to look for, such as a special building set apart for sacred functions, special fixtures like altars, and the paraphernalia of rituals such as gongs, bells, lamps, and so forth. Water is often involved in rites, so pools or basins may be of significance, and the sacrifice of animals or humans could be practiced. Cult images and symbols can be apparent, together with a depiction of people in what looks, to our eyes, like an act of adoration, while votive offerings of food or objects, often broken or hidden, may be found. Finally, important religious buildings or centers are often associated with great wealth in contents and decoration. Any of these items on its own will not tell one very much, but if a number of them are found together in a single archaeological context, then a cognitive archaeologist is on relatively solid ground in interpreting the evidence as involving occult usage. The same applies to whole collections of rich objects found in special circumstances, such as the Iron Age weapons thrown into the River Thames, or great hoards of metalwork in Scandinavian bogs, or the huge quantities of symbolically rich objects and people thrown by the Maya into the cenote at Chichen Itza. It is highly unlikely, though theoretically possible, that all this material ended up in the waters through carelessness rather than through ritual deposition. All in all, therefore, cognitive archaeology can make some valid assessments of minds which are long vanished from this earth. In other areas, however, it requires enormous optimism and involves a triumph of mind over matter. At its best, it provides stimulating hypotheses based on historical or modern information, especially from the accounts of the conquistadors or early missionaries and colonizers, or on careful deductions from the material remains themselves. At its worst, however, it is filled with wishful thinking, particularly where attempts to interpret prehistoric art are concerned. It produces just so stories, sheer fiction thought up to explain the material remains, and through which the authors reveal themselves to be frustrated novelists. This is the end of Chapter 5.